Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the third of a series of webinars for the public health community that are being held this week, which is the week that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control Negotiations, COP9 of the FCTC, was scheduled to take place at The Hague. But unfortunately, have been postponed until 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's webinar focuses on a topic that's quite dear to my heart, which is how to incorporate human rights into the FCTC, how to use human rights mechanisms to advance the FCTC, and how to promote the FCTC and tobacco control as an accelerator to reach globally agreed human rights objectives. ASH has been intimately involved with all of the FCTC negotiations and the FCTC process, so it's an honor for me to moderate this discussion today. The FCTC has great potential as an accelerator towards health, development, as well as human rights goals. So it's critical that our public health community takes full advantage of the various human rights platforms that are available to us to promote the FCTC as a best practice tool to advance human rights objectives, to point out to inaction at country level when a country fails to adequately implement the FCTC to protect the health of their citizens, and to denounce tobacco industry interference in national implementation of the FCTC. During the presentations today, you will hear from 4 fantastic speakers. Before I introduce them, a quick housekeeping issue. There will be plenty of time for Q&A, questions and answers after the presentations. You can type them, your questions already in the Q&A box, which is for me, it's at the bottom of the screen. You can feel free to direct them to a specific speaker. And note that the PowerPoints will be made available to those who have registered for the webinar. So I want to welcome our first panelist. It's Professor Steve Marks, and he's the François-Xavier Bagnoud Professor of Health and Human Rights at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health University. He's an expert on health, law, and human rights, and he will give us an overview of the connection between tobacco and human rights. Steve, please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. This is a great pleasure and an honor for me to be part of this webinar. I assume that you can see my slides. My title is The Nexus Between Tobacco Control and Human Rights. And I am very pleased to be able to provide an overview on the assumption that I'm speaking to people who are not specialists in human rights or on human rights and tobacco control, but are specialists rather on tobacco control, and for whom it would be useful to have, oh dear, I have a problem because the slide is not switching. There we go. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to make a presentation that will begin by answering the assumption that some people have that there's an incompatibility between human rights and tobacco control. And then I want to examine whether or not public health is an adequate framework in itself. Why add another complex framework such as human rights to the field? And then the answer to that question will be, of course, what are the linkages in basic approach to human rights and tobacco control, but that's not terribly interesting for the people who are here. What's more interesting are the practical applications of those linkages. What does it mean if we were actually convinced that linking tobacco control and human rights is valuable? So my first point is to pose the question of whether or not in the public health community, we need to look with skepticism on a human rights framework, especially when it comes to such things as tobacco and guns. When I started my career in 21 years ago at the Harvard School of Public Health, I started attending meetings of specialists in bioethics and ethics and human rights. And one of the first things I encountered is the suspicion that was expressed that human rights rhetoric can be co-opted by the opponents of public health. And one of their main examples is tobacco smokers and the tobacco industry and the gun industry. So that surprised me because I've come from the human rights field and I didn't know that this would be a threat. And then I discovered that indeed the language of human rights has been co-opted by the tobacco industry and by smokers. And I discovered such things as World Smokers Day, which builds upon this concept of smokers' rights and even utilizes the language that was familiar to me from the beginning, which is that of the human rights framework within the United Nations. And this type of language came out from the World Smokers Day, Smokers' Rights Declaration, which included this language that although the United Nations no longer seems to believe in or abide by their own declaration on human rights, smokers are here to remind them that at least one segment of global society take all their articles seriously. Well, that's kind of weird and spooky that they want to take the human rights framework and say, this defends our right to smoke. But there are numerous other organizations that do this. There's a New York-based organization called the Citizens Lobby Against Smoker Harassment, and they issued the Smokers' Rights Declaration, again, drawing on the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is essential for smokers to rebel against tyranny and oppression. Now, rebellion against tyranny and oppression is the language taken from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the important point to make here, this is by way of kind of a humorous starting point for my presentation, because we all know that it's a radical distortion of the human rights framework to say it justifies the right to own a gun or the right to smoke. The human rights framework, as we will see, provides a very robust counter argument to that, saying that from a human rights perspective, smokers do not have a right to injure others, and there is an obligation of the state to advance the protection of health, which is to eliminate and to bring an end to consumption of tobacco products. But who needs human rights if you have, and this is my second point, who needs human rights if the public health field is there to say, we have ethics, we have a bioethical framework, we have public health ethics, we have public health policy, and in that public health policy, we are certainly addressing the tobacco epidemic. And after all, where is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control? Well, the Framework Convention is part of the World Health Organization, an organization devoted to international cooperation in the field of public health. These human rights folks are down the road there, let them do their business, but we're public health people. We know what we're doing. And that's because the public health framework offers an approach to addressing problems. It collects data, it identifies the risks, and it does research, and then it launches interventions. This is what we're doing in the tobacco control field. We collect the data, we find out what are the risk factors of smoking. We know that it causes cancer, we know that it causes all the other diseases. And then we develop interventions and we evaluate those interventions and we scale up. And this is what the tobacco control framework is all about. It's a public health approach. Well, for those of you who are not familiar with it, let me give you an extremely brief approach to understanding what is the functional equivalent in the human rights field. And the human rights approach seeks to identify problems in the world and through an authoritative decision-making process, define norms that clarify what our society expects as the fundamental requirements of a decent society. That we hold certain values to be so fundamental that we put them as fundamental rights in our Constitution and as international human rights in international agreements. And this takes a process that we engage in day to day of studying the problem, drafting a declaration, ratcheting it up to a legally binding convention, obtaining ratifications of the convention, and then implementing what we call the norm enforcing process, in which we develop measures to see that the rights are respected, promoted, and fulfilled. That terminology, as we'll see in a minute, is critically important to understanding how the human rights framework can contribute to tobacco control. So let me move right away to the theoretical linkages between tobacco control and human rights. If we claim that there is a parallel approach to dealing with global issues, parallel to the public health approach, which is the human rights approach, how do these linkages occur? Well, all of those of you who work in the Framework Convention know very well that the Framework Convention, way back when it was drafted, embedded human rights into it. It recalls exactly the fundamental international treaty norm on the right to health, which is Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It recalls the definition of human rights in the Constitution of WHO itself, which refers to health as one of the fundamental rights of every human being. And it even mentions the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which recognizes the right of the child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. So embedded already in the Framework Convention are these references to human rights. But now let's step back. That's language that you could say was wishful thinking and nobody really took it seriously. And at the beginning, nobody really did take it seriously. One of the purposes of this webinar is to draw upon people who are taking it seriously and convince others to take it seriously. So what is the right to health? It was alluded to in those brief passages in the Framework Convention. It is alluded to also extremely briefly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but primarily in Article 12, that is explicitly referred to in the Framework Convention of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The right to health also appears in Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It appears in the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It appears in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. These core human rights treaties of the UN contain the right to health. Now let's dig a little deeper into Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Yes, the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest sustainable standard of physical and mental health draws from the WHO Constitution. But it's even in the initial formulation of 1966, it enumerated that there are certain environmental and industrial hygiene issues and eliminating epidemic diseases and behavioral rated health concerns. In the interpretation of that I'm going to refer to in a minute by the committee entrusted with monitoring the implementation of that treaty, it also defined that Article 12.2 as requiring that governments discourage the use of tobacco. And just for your broader reference, the regional human rights treaties also contain the right to health, whether it's in the European framework, in the African framework, in the Inter-American framework, in the Arab framework, or the ASEAN framework. All of these human rights treaties have right to health. Now, it wasn't until the early 2000s that some of us tried to articulate that right to health framework and the complex webs of international cooperation to implement the right to health that was highly relevant to a human right to tobacco control, by which we mean that the right to health, if it does not involve robust measures to realize tobacco control, is failing to meet its obligations. And others have reconceptualized human rights to challenge tobacco, such as Rangita and Dick's article here, which was excellent. In a book that we co-edited on Achieving the Universal Right to Health, an important chapter there, and I told you I'd come back to Respect, Protect, and Fulfill, an important chapter there by Oscar Cabrera and Larry Gostin articulates the core definition of the obligations of the right to health that were in that General Comment 12, that are the obligations to respect, which means the state must take measures to actively promote or refrain from taking measures that promote tobacco products. To protect means, and that's the most important one, and that's what this webinar is really all about, is the obligation of the state under the right to health to prevent third parties, including business entities, from endangering health through the tobacco marketing and distribution and so on. And that's the duty then to regulate the tobacco industry as part of the obligation that states have to protect the right to health. And to fulfill is to take comprehensive tobacco control legislation. Briefly mentioning the place that you need to turn to clarify these obligations of the right to health is to turn to this general comment, which is an interpretation of the content of the right to health prepared by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Tobacco is mentioned in two important places here. As I said earlier, Article 12.2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights refers to the need for discouraging the abuse of certain products, explicitly mentioning tobacco along with drugs and other harmful substances. It also refers to the need for appropriate information, which certainly relates to making people aware of the dangers of tobacco. And an interesting point here is that that document also clarifies when can we say there's been a violation of the right to health. And it actually explicitly states that the failure to discourage production, marketing, and consumption of tobacco constitutes a failure on the part of each state party, the 198 states party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to fulfill its obligations under the right to health. It is a violation. So, if that's the case, what practical steps can we take to hold governments accountable to those obligations? Those working in civil society, I would direct you to this handbook for civil society. I'm working with the United Nations Human Rights Program. Draw upon that to refresh your memory on some of the mechanisms. I'm going to briefly allude to a number of mechanisms. You have other opportunities here to look at item 6 here is litigating national and international cases. People will be presenting on European action. The development agenda is another framework. But the ones that I'm going to focus on are the treaty monitoring bodies, the special procedures, the UPR, and the business and human rights agenda. So the treaty monitoring process is to take that interpretation of Article 12 and extend it to the reporting and communications and complaints procedures under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and similar instruments, so that civil society organizations can and do, ASH has been helpful of this, and several other organizations have been extremely helpful in preparing and submitting to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights parallel reports in which we provide the information that allows members of the committee to learn that a government that has reported on what it's done to implement Article 12 has not done enough to implement its obligations under the requirements for tobacco control. Special procedures are the mechanisms by which the Human Rights Council, which you see pictured here, designates individuals and sometimes small committees to examine a particular topic. The right to health is one of those topics. The Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health has begun to open up to drawing attention through resolutions at the Human Rights Council on tobacco control and the right to health. And the third mechanism is the Universal Periodic Review, which is a process by which every country is examined periodically by the Human Rights Council, whether it's ratified treaties or not, which is important for the United States, which has not ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. All countries come under this review, and civil society organizations, UN agencies, and so on, submit information to let the Human Rights Council know where they have failed to fulfill their obligations. And failure to adequately implement the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is part of that Universal Periodic Review. So I'm deliberately trying to keep this as brief as possible because what is exciting now in COP9 is that it will be the opportunity, thanks to the government of Ecuador, for the participants, the states parties to the Framework Convention, to examine in greater detail how the Convention Secretariat and the states parties can increase the effectiveness of the interaction with the human rights framework. And this requires greater collaboration between the Convention Secretariat and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It requires working with the working group that I'm going to conclude with in the next slide on transnational corporations and human rights that is drafting a legally binding instrument on business and human rights. Well, where is the tobacco industry in that? And under the Sustainable Development Goals, Target 3A refers explicitly to the Framework Convention. What is being done to reinforce that from a human rights perspective? And then, as I mentioned earlier, under the treaty bodies, are we fully utilizing the reporting process under the treaty, the human rights treaties? So to conclude with a reference to the current efforts to draft an international convention to implement the United Nations general guiding principles on business and human rights. The Cape Town Declaration that is going to be referred to in a minute refers to the cessation and marketing of tobacco in the tobacco industry. Given the nature of that, we said in the Cape Town Declaration that the tobacco industry should not be part of the efforts to bring in the business community into doing a better job on respecting human rights. In a few days, in 5 days from now, the United Nations Forum on Business and Human Rights is going to meet on the basis of this concept note for a virtual forum, which will take place beginning on the 16th of November. And its topic is preventing business-related human rights abuses, the key to a sustainable future for people and the planet. Now, this is clearly an opportunity to look at the tobacco industry as a business that is responsible for human rights abuses. After all, this is the product, as we constantly say, that if used as directed, kills 50% of those who consume it. However, from what I can see in this concept note and the preparation for this forum that is taking place in 5 days, the tobacco industry is not on the agenda. Similarly, the process of the open-ended working group, the open-ended international working group on business enterprises and human rights is in the drafting stage of a binding instrument. And the open-ended intergovernmental working group on transnational corporations and other business enterprises with respect to human rights, long title, met under the chairmanship of the ambassador of Ecuador just a few weeks ago at its 6th session, in which it looked at the second revised draft of this treaty. And the report of that session points out that mentioned that the treaty in this second draft needs to move into a third draft, and in order to do so, needs input from states and other relevant stakeholders. That means the tobacco control community, of course, and the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, to provide concrete textual suggestions, modifications, and additional language. The fact of the matter is that the second draft of this binding treaty on business and human rights does not mention the tobacco industry. And the big challenge here is, as the Cape Town Declaration stated, the tobacco industry is not like other industries that need to be brought on board to do a better job to protect human rights. The tobacco industry needs to be excluded, not to be a partner in this. The issue, as far as I can tell, remains to be addressed head-on in the process of drafting the binding treaty on business enterprises and human rights. So my question in conclusion is, will the Framework Convention Secretariat and the tobacco control community rise to the occasion? The deadline is February 2021 to make textual suggestions in this treaty. That's one example of the mechanisms available to utilize a human rights approach to advance the purposes of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and our commitment to achieving an end game for tobacco. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marks, and thank you for pointing out all those opportunities and those platforms that we really must use as a public health community to be able to frame how the behavior of the tobacco industry, the selling of those products violates the rights of citizens, rights that have been recognized at the highest level through international human rights treaties. Our next, my computer froze for a second. Our next speaker is Dr. Flavia Senkubuge, President of the Colleges of Medicine at South Africa, and she will discuss the Cape Town Declaration on Human Rights and Tobacco-Free World. That's a seminal declaration that was adopted 2 years ago at the Cape Town during the World Conference on Tobacco Health. Flavia, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent, and thank you so much always for being on these webinars. It's always such a great honor for me to be here. And I had a chuckle just seeing that picture because, colleagues, that was just after we'd signed the Cape Town Declaration on Human Rights. And I want to say that it is such an important document to discuss because not only is it seminal, but really this Cape Town Declaration, which was signed at the 17th World Conference on Tobacco Health meeting that was held in Cape Town in March in 2018, where I was the president of the conference, really starts to articulate quite clearly one of the calls of that particular conference, which is to adopt a new architecture that will include what we term here in Africa the concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are. And I'm so excited that Professor Marks really quite articulated the intersectionality of public health and the human rights agenda. And this is critically important. And so this seminal document really is looking at our firm commitment to promoting and protecting public health and human rights, and really a huge recognition that these cannot be separated. We have a number of guiding principles, and I will highlight a few of them because the document will be provided to you, colleagues, and I'd really like for you to go through it and have a look at the areas where you could contribute. At the moment, we have 165 signatory organizations, which I think is absolutely incredible, and 54 experts who have signed this particular declaration. And I would hope that many of you who are on this webinar will lend your voice and lend your signature and your organization in terms of advancing the agenda of this declaration. Our guiding principles on the human rights and tobacco control firstly start off by looking at the human rights which are applicable to tobacco control. And really we are in an agreement, as Professor Marks has just said, that the manufacture, the marketing and the sale of the tobacco are incompatible to the human right to health. And this is something that is key and important. And as I've been speaking in other forums, even if I only said that, that will be more than enough. And I think it is also critically important we recognize and reaffirm that the position that has been taken by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in its general comment, which is comment number 14, that really states failure to discourage production, marketing and consumption of tobacco constitutes a violation of the obligation to protect the right to health. And this is really articulated under Article 12. And in terms of the concept of a tobacco-free world, it really is important to recognize that as a component of human rights, this really implies that there's an obligation to the states to address the human rights implication, not only looking at a tiny little snapshot, but really over the whole life cycle of from tobacco growing, manufacturing, marketing, distribution, consumption, all the way to post-consumption, where we have to include the agenda of child labor, the violation of the workers' rights, and the role of special populations, as well as looking at environmental destruction, which is a key agenda component. When we come to the next obligation, which is the human rights and their relevance to FCTC, this is something that many of you colleagues would be working on, and really is again to say that there is an agreement that the manufacture, the marketing, and the sale of tobacco are incompatible with the human rights obligations that have been accepted when states ratified the FCTC. But not only that, all other global and regional human rights treaties as well. And in fact, also other signatories and also laws within country, for instance, their constitutions, in particular the right to health, which is enshrined in most constitutions globally, and which really includes ensuring that populations have a safe and healthy working conditions. There's also the, for instance, in South Africa, we have a Bill of Rights. Many countries also have the children's rights, and also including the protection of children who we know are part of tobacco production. And also that we cannot leave out the issues of women's rights, including the protection and the impact of smoking on pregnancy. And this is something that also came out quite strongly in the 2018 conference in terms of looking at that. And so, colleagues, then, if I want to look just as a snapshot of the UN Developmental Agenda, and just to say Target 3A is critically important in terms of us looking at the human rights agenda, but really we need to remove the word appropriate, because as it reads now, it's about strengthening the control of all countries as appropriate. And I think this is a watering down of this. And I think lastly, I really want to say the call to action to promote and protect to the right of a tobacco-free world is critically important. And we invite the Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health to include the right to a tobacco-free world as a component of the right to health and its thematic and in her thematic and country reports. And thank you so much, Kelsey.
Thank you so much, Flavia. And thank you for pointing out that the behavior of the tobacco industry and their products affects many, many rights, women's rights, children's rights, and so on and so forth, as well as something that's absolutely critical. Our next speaker is going to address the linkage between the Conference of the Parties and the FCTC. He will address the link between really how to integrate it in a very, very practical manner through a decision that's being proposed. So next speaker is Pablo Ana Louisa. He's a clinical psychologist at Central University of Ecuador and a specialist and coordinator of mental health promotion at the Ministry of Public Health of Ecuador. He will present the proposed decision on the contribution of the FCTC to human rights. But before he begins his presentation, there will be a short video from the president of the meeting of the parties of the protocol of the FCTC, the illicit protocol, Dr. Fernando Jacome, and he will do a short video on the importance of human rights-based approach. Pablo Ana Louisa, adelante.
Buen día con todos, muchas gracias.
Good morning, thank you very much.
Good afternoon with everybody. My name is Fernando Jacome, and I am the National Director of the Ministry of Health of Ecuador, and I am the President of the Protocol of Trading Products. The set out by our government for the 9th Conference of the Parties of the FCTC, we must highlight as strategic the effective and full mainstreaming of the human rights perspectives within the implementation of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Since 2016, through COP7, Ecuador has led a bilateral dialogue process aimed to recognize and position the obligation of states to and promote the enjoy to the highest possible level of health in implementing the Framework Convention. It's essential to consider human rights and implementation of the Convention and Protocol as complementary aims, enabling states parties to strengthen compliance with their human rights, frameworks, and commitments, and especially those links to the right to health. Under this scenario, and echoing the comments submitted to the proposal of decision sponsored by our country during COP8, we will present a new strengthened proposal. As part of this, we will urge parties to consider including efforts to implement the World Health Organization FCTC by collaborating with United Nations human rights mechanisms and especially the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. We have work ahead, so I invite everyone to continue to join work to secure a successful conference of the parties and ensure a world free of the tobacco epidemic, responsible of the direct death of more than 8 million dead people every year. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Eso era un poco el mensaje.
Thank you very much. That was a little bit of the message that Dr. Fernando Jacome shared with us, President, in charge right now is showing the compromise that the country has to this proposal that the country has made that had been in discussion already for a while, and we hope that it can be adopted by the conference. I would like to start a little bit by giving some short background about what the activities that the country of Ecuador and also at the regional level, what has been done in order to be able to position the topic of human rights in the context of the tobacco.
The next, please. Bueno, varios órganos
Okay, several human rights organizations have already shown the need for several countries, to exercise and implement the objectives regarding the tobacco consumption and also to link them with human rights when considering the ratification for the framework convention. As a country in COP7 in 2016 had already started to talk about the need to include this topic within the actions of tobacco control. However, we have to consider that this is not a new topic. It has a long history, but during the last years, we have been able to become more real. For COP7 and for FCTC COP7 6, we had started talking about the international cooperation in order to implement including human rights. In this decision, we basically had two main issues that drawing the attention to the parties in order to talk about these issues. Also, encouraging the parties to link the human rights issues in the development of activities to face the tobacco epidemic, but also inviting the Secretary of the Convention to invite other UN organizations to be able to protect the public health interests regarding the business interests and other interests that the tobacco industry generally creates. These two proposals were established during COP7 in 2016, and they help so the Ecuador with the regional cooperation and also with the civil population can start on a draft so that it can link in a more direct way to include the framework convention with human rights. What happened after COP7? For COP8, we have to understand a little bit that at the regional level, we talk about the pre-COP, which is what we call them. During these pre-COP, Ecuador presented a proposal named through human rights. This proposal for a decision was a first draft, which included the contributions of several countries at the regional level, which had very good reception. And it did not just have the support at the country level, but also from representatives from the civil organizations such as ASH and other organizations at the world level, international level, which also supported the linkage between these two topics, which guarantee the right to health. On COP8, Ecuador proposed or presented this proposal, and it had the support from all the regions, really. However, there was a state, which country, which for not being able to have enough time to review the proposal, it was not able to support it, and it was not able to finalize this decision for this proposal. There was a long debate regarding this issue, and at the end, the name of this proposal ended up being a contribution by WHO for the encouragement promotion of human rights. This created a big debate within COP, and unfortunately, it was not able to be approved. This was the only document that was not approved because of this objection, or because of this difficulty which happened with this participating state, which argued that it had not enough time to review and to analyze the proposal. And it has suggested that the issue has been the topic has been included in COP9. As we know, because of the pandemic, which has had several consequences, not only in the area of health, this has been postponed until 2021, which will be included as a topic in the agenda to be able to discuss this. Next, please. Now, how is this the proposal of this decision in general terms, and through which we as a country are giving the support, and also carrying out the technical analyses, and also conversations with other participating states, the regional and international level. What is it that we decided? First, we decided to include the topic of human rights in the COP9 agenda, and it also requested the Secretariat to work jointly with Ecuador to be able to draft once more this proposal, which was presented at COP8, and to be able to discuss this new proposal for the new conference. What this proposal includes, which is the draft with which we ended COP8, is basically two issues which go from starting from the acknowledging the obligation to promote the enjoyment at the highest level of health. First, encourage the participating states to consider the possibility to include the efforts to increase the framework convention, and the proposal to ask the Secretariat to work in the improvement of the coordination and cooperation with the Office of the Highest Commissioner for the United Nations to make aware the Framework Convention in the fulfillment of human rights. In general terms, this is what we are presently in the draft, which is being proposed. What the country has done, basically, is starting from this document, is to work jointly in cooperation with other actors in a technical document, which can also provide the necessary things so that the parties can have the context needed. So why is this fulfillment of human rights linked with the implementation of the Framework Convention? And why is it necessary to adopt this decision at the next COP? Next, please. Now, what are the objectives and the benefits of this decision, human rights, at the next COP? I think that during the framework of the speeches that the other panelists have given, I think we can evidence the direct linkage that exists between the right to health and the general framework of human rights, and also in the control, the tobacco control. But we also have to have the Framework Convention guarantees the right to the highest level possible of health of all the countries. All the articles of the Framework Convention are linked to that objective, in addition to others. And the right to health is a right to protect this convention especially. In addition to this, governments are required to comply with the dispositions of the treaties of which they are belong. In regards to the Framework Convention, they are also required to comply because of the ratification that these instruments that are made with the articles that it has. In this case, the Framework Convention. And here there is something interesting that we need to mention. The inclusion of this topic of human rights in this COP does not add new responsibilities to the participating states, but on the contrary, what it does is to establish synergies between the Framework Convention and other human rights organisms from the UN. What the purpose is establish this synergy to establish this collaborating process between the Framework Convention and also human rights. Also, the implementation of the Framework Convention helps countries, it helps countries so that the countries can achieve the compromises, what it has, which is also, we have also talked about the right to a healthy environment, taking into consideration the secondhand smoke and prevention against nicotine, which is also a necessary subject, but also being exposed to pesticides during the process of tobacco agriculture, which is not completely visible, but it is also important to acknowledge it as such. Also, the topic of the right to information, in considering the risks that nicotine consumption exposes people to, or the things that tobacco has, and also the diseases that the tobacco consumption has. Also, the right to education, the right to access to information, which are closely linked to tobacco control, and also to the different articles that Framework Convention establishes. Also, talking about tobacco as human rights, it helps governments to comply with the convention's requirements and also other human rights treaties. So this same synergy of which we are talking about, for example, Article number 13 of the Framework Convention, which it asks of the parties, is to prohibit any ads promoting tobacco, and this is in conjunction with the Committee of Rights in number 14, which affirms that we have to discourage the production of tobacco because it constitutes a violation to human health. This framework, this proposal is also linked the compliance and the implementation by other organisms, other human rights instruments, which may be linked to health. Finally, the implementation of the Framework Convention and the relationship or the cooperation within the framework of human rights helps the parties to utilize human rights to strengthen the efforts in regards to world action and other preventive measures in relation to non-transmissible diseases. This is a clear subject which has already been debated, and this is an important point that the participating countries should have in mind when talking about the need of linking it to human rights and of reviewing this proposal. Within this framework, I think it's very useful to have these spaces because it allows us in some way to encourage or to ask the parties that are not part of this to also think about these efforts about implementing the convention with human rights mechanisms. I think that this is one of the objectives that this proposal is after, to aside from strengthening these with human rights international organizations. And in this process, this is where we find ourselves as a country, listening to the invitation to again propose this, present this draft at COP9. We have been taking we have been careful to have the necessary arguments and to present them at the opportune time so that all the parts can have the document beforehand and it can be approved. And this decision can be approved at the next CON9, and so that it can establish during the process of implementation in regards to human rights. This is all, and I am here available for any questions during in regards to the Framework Convention. Thank you very much for the space.
And thank you for this setting this framework and presenting the decision, the proposed decision, which really demonstrates and articulates the mutually reinforcing nature of the FCTC human rights agenda and the development agenda, particularly the Sustainable Development Agenda, and how this decision could help increase collaboration between the FCTC and human rights, the human rights platforms like the UN Human Rights Council, for example. We have noted that we are really almost at the edge of time. We have one last presentation, so I asked if people are willing to stay for a little longer, maybe 10 minutes longer, to have time for the Q&A. Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy from ASH will give a quick last presentation, and then we'll open up to the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy. As Laurent mentioned, I'm the managing attorney at ASH, and I work on our human rights program. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to speed through a couple of these slides here. But I wanted to talk about why a COP decision on human rights is important to civil society. Next slide, please. This is about a human rights-based approach to tobacco control. Steve covered a fair amount of this, so I'm not going to spend too long on it. I just wanted to mention and highlight the fact that when we're talking about human rights, we're talking about a relationship between individuals and the government, not about corporations. It's about what governments have agreed to do, both explicitly and implicitly. So the more mentions of tobacco, the stronger the argument on that slide is. This slide is about the Ruggie principles, which Steve also mentioned, so we can just skip this one too. Next slide, thanks. This is a word graphic made from the text of a recent submission that ASH made to the Human Rights Council. I wanted to create a visual to highlight how linked these issues are. You see that tobacco and the FCTC are large, but so is health, so is rights, so is development. And it's really important for our advocacy work that the human rights community view tobacco control as a human rights issue. And at ASH, we spend a lot of time and energy talking to human rights bodies about doing that. But it's equally important that the public health community view tobacco as a human rights issue. And a potential COP decision will help solidify that. Next slide, please. The question that I think logically follows next is, how do we use human rights to advance public health? If we're having a COP decision, how do we use that? The first step is obviously a human rights decision at COP, and we hope you all can support that. Hopefully, we can then use that decision to bolster our advocacy in litigation, in country reporting, in the Human Rights Council, and in other international mechanisms. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk about litigation. We can use human rights arguments in court. Happy to discuss further at another time. Next slide, please. The next advocacy action I mentioned is country reports. This is a report from Argentina, where the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women actually called on Argentina to ratify the FCTC. Having a COP decision in hand when we go to these treaty bodies to advocate will make that connection even stronger for them and encourage them to take action in their jurisdictions. Next slide, please. A lot of times, human rights approach to tobacco control is viewed as sort of abstract and theoretical. Most people think it sounds great, but it can't really be used in practice. So I wanted to give one really concrete example of how we're doing that. The complaint on this page is a current case that ASH is involved in. ASH and our partners at the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council and the American Medical Association filed a complaint against the FDA for their inaction on menthol cigarettes. We are also doing work on this area with menthol-related advocacy in the international system. There's a treaty on the elimination of racial discrimination called ICERD, and a committee that goes along with it. And we've been submitting answers to their calls for information, sending them letters, and looking for all available advocacy opportunities there. So we're working really hard to connect the two, our FDA lawsuit, which is a domestic action, and the interests of the international sphere together to achieve the goal of banning menthol in the United States. So I think it's really starting to come together, and it's interesting to see this sort of live action case study of how these two things can work together. Next slide, please. Last year, ASH launched our Tobacco and Human Rights Hub. We have templates for reports like the one to CEDA or to ICERD that I've mentioned, background information, etc. The hub's constantly growing. We're working to add resources in other languages. And if you have a resource you'd like to share, please feel free to email it to me to add. Next slide, please. In addition, we run 2 listservs. The first you can sign up for on our hub, and we'll provide human rights alerts. The second is more of an advocacy working group, the HRTCN listserv. That's a closed group. If you're interested, you can email me and we can see if we can get you added. There's also the FCA Human Rights Task Force for COP-specific human rights work. I didn't put that on the slide, but you can contact me to be added to that one as well. Next slide. I encourage you to get in touch with me if you're interested in writing a country report, or if you have any questions on using a human rights-based approach. We'd be more than happy to help. Sorry to rush through, but I hope we have a few minutes for Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you so much for providing those concrete examples of how we've been engaging with the human rights mechanisms to address the issue of tobacco. And so I'm going to go straight to the Q&A section. We have already a number of questions. And the first one is on deals to how to practically use this. So Steve, you mentioned, for example, the Transnational Treaty on Business and Human Rights and the possibility to engage in that process. And one of the attendees mentions that, maybe we don't have to wait for the treaty. The European Commission, for example, presents a legislative proposal that would essentially make the UN Guiding Principles, business and human rights mandatory. And just last week, I noted that there are a number of countries that have adopted national plans associated with the guiding businesses, the guiding principles on business and human rights. But I looked into it and I didn't see a single one that had tobacco in it. So a question to Steve and Flavia, maybe, is that a failure of our part, not having done the adequate effort yet to ensure that those are included in it? And what could we or what should we do to make sure that tobacco then is addressed in those national plans?
Laurent, Ruben Zanflitz's question is a really challenging one because, and I hadn't really thought of it before. Let me put it this way. The draft binding instrument on business and human rights and the European Commission's text that will be adopted in 2021 indeed probably lay out obligations for the business community to respect human rights and to do no harm in ways that the tobacco industry could never meet. So the question is, are we better off with texts like that we know the tobacco industry is excluded from because they can never meet them? Their product does harm, systematically does harm, couldn't possibly meet it. Or is it necessary to include a reference to the particular nature of the tobacco industry in the text itself, whether it's the European Commission's text or the Intergovernmental Working Group's text? And I'd like to mention once again, as I showed in my last slide, the deadline is February 2021. It's right on us now. It is the opportunity to resolve that issue, to find the appropriate language to say that there are some industries that we do not want to partner with to improve human rights. They are by definition harmful to human rights. Do we want to include that language in the text or not? If so, what is that language? The opportunity to submit it is February 2021.
Thank you, Steve. And there's a precedent for this, given that we were able to exclude the tobacco industry, for example, from the UN high-level meeting on NCDs in 2011.
Right.
It was made explicit that, and there's some other precedent like this. But I'm still calling on the tobacco control and public health community to note that many of our countries have national plans to implement the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And France has it, Spain has one, Switzerland has one, Germany has one. A lot of the European countries do have them. And because tobacco, I've not seen tobacco being addressed in any of those plans, so I encourage us as a public health community to make sure that we correct that and we use those platforms to advance tobacco control policy. My next question is one on the, and it's linked to the harm reduction. And the question is there a right to e-cigarettes or harm reduction products or as a harm reduction? Some papers compare e-cigarettes to the provision of methadone or safe needle exchanges for drug users. So they argue that the human rights are denied if e-cigarettes are not supported. What are your thoughts on this? I don't know if Kelsey or Flavia or Steve want to, who wants to give that one a try?
I can take a stab at that one. I think if e-cigarettes are concluded to help people quit after a lot of scientific study, I think that might be something that should be included in access to cessation. But at this point, I don't think there's enough scientific evidence to declare that. And I think there are other things that we know help people quit, and government should be providing support for those.
And also a clarification that I think I'd like to make is that a genuine human rights or a genuine harm reduction approach tries to minimize both the harm of a drug addiction and as well decrease the prevalence of the addiction within the general population.
Agreed.
So it's very, very different if we use harm-reduced tobacco products for smokers to help them quit. But it's a very different approach to provide a platform that allows the tobacco industry to flood the market and increase nicotine addiction, even if it's with a less harmful product. And I think that's a big distinction to make when we talk about harm reduction. And in the context of humans should be, as much as possible, their right to be healthy, as well as their right to be free from an addiction should be protected by the state. The next question is a more legal one. It comes from Amos Hausner from Israel. And is the obligation to respect those human rights part of any domestic existing laws? And can it be cited in courts as a source for the imposition of liability on either states or the tobacco industry, including both international and domestic courts? And I know that the answer is yes, but I'll let lawyers respond. Kelsey or Steve, do you want to?
That's really one for Kelsey because she's been involved in that. A lot of this litigation has been following it, and Flavia as well. Obviously, the principle is a basic one. The human rights framework is quite meaningless if it remains theoretical and wishful thinking at the international level. Respect for human rights is supposed to be part of domestic law. It is a requirement, a principle of international law. When you ratify an international treaty, you accept international obligations to include in your domestic legal system these obligations. So those countries that have ratified international treaties containing the right to health and who fail to have adequate legislation locally with remedies, are failing to meet their international obligations. And so what are the liabilities for that? I think probably Kelsey or Flavia or somebody else could provide concrete examples.
So I think the best example is when a country has included the right to health in their constitution. And Flavia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe South Africa has had some litigation around specifically access to medicines. I think dialysis is one example that have made it through on a right to health legal challenge.
AIDS.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have it enshrined in our constitution, the right to health. And I think one of the base case studies to cite is during our HIV and AIDS and provision of antiretrovirals. So that's one of them, absolutely.
And Kelsey, I don't know that there's some countries where it's been cited the right to health. So for example, in the context of in Peru, upholding the smoke-free policy law was based on human rights principles and human rights law. Is that correct?
Yes, and there's been cases around the world that are doing that more and more. There's a case in India. I think it's becoming more prominent to use that argument.
Actually, you'll see, for those of you who are interested, and I urge you all to go to the Cape Town Declaration available on the website of ASH, and you will see in there a rather lengthy paragraph devoted to that Indian case, which has the most far-reaching language that I've ever found in any national litigation relating to justifying why the constitutional right to health, in the case of the Indian Constitution, Article 21, on the right to life extended to mean the right to health as well, requires that the states stop this or take measures to stop this harm-causing product and to put an end to it. And this had to do with tobacco labeling and pictorial representations on the covers. So you'll find that reference in the Cape Town Declaration.
So to add to this, and it's a question on how far can we go and how can we use human rights rhetoric as well as human rights law to advance public health. And regarding this context, is it possible to use human rights arguments to go to phase out the sale of cigarettes, or someone asked even ban cigarette sales?
Absolutely. I think that the Danish Institute on Human Rights made a statement a couple of years ago that is very compatible with that. It's hard to see how you can meet human rights requirements and sell cigarettes. So I think those two ideas go hand in hand, that phasing out the sale of cigarettes is absolutely a human rights issue.
Well, thank you so much. I went first to Steve, please go ahead.
Well, in a previous panel, you had the examples of Southern California, where on January 1st in Beverly Hills, to the first case, there will be a banning of the sales, and that was the subject of that panel. The interesting thing is, and I discovered this by joining the tobacco control community a decade or so ago, that the tobacco control community seems to want to avoid the concept of prohibition because of the societal dangers involved in that. The ultimate result is the elimination of this industry entirely. But starting by a ban, a prohibition, might be counterproductive, is the only way I understand it. The objective is the same, and we need to approach it through measures that can be implemented progressively. If it ends up by the whole world behaving like Beverly Hills and banning the sale, great. But starting with a prohibition could be counterproductive.
Well, thank you all for your comments. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the panelists for taking the time and presenting today. I want to thank all of you also, and sorry that today we ran a few minutes past the time. We have 2 more webinars during this week of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control COP9, the week of negotiations. So we have one tomorrow on the relationship between COVID-19 and the FCTC, and that will be joined by the head of the Secretariat, as well as you will hear from examples from countries and cessation and how to improve cessation in the context of COVID-19. And on Friday, a presentation on funding and how to address the funding gap for FCTC implementation. Thank you very much, and stay tuned, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.